So a very warm welcome, a good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this BA Community webinar, User Experience Foundations. My name is Adrian Reed, but I'm very pleased to say that we are joined this evening by Nick Voil. Now, I've known Nick Voil for a number of years now. In fact, I think the first time I saw him present, believe it or not, was in 2009 at the BA Conference Europe. And I'm not sure if you remember this, Nick, but you were, I think, the last speaker of the last day, which is always a really hard slot. And I remember being really interested in what Nick had to say about user experience. A lot I could say about Nick. Nick is a certified management consultant and an accredited trainer in agile business analysis and project management. He's got an MSc in human computer interaction and a BA in computer studies and Russian. But of particular interest, he's currently in the process of writing and publishing a book by BCS called User Experience Foundations. And so I'm really pleased that Nick will be joining us to talk about user experience today, particularly with a business analysis lens as well. So with a presentation entitled User Experience Foundations, Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and welcome everybody. The first thing I like to say, I know Adrian will say this later, but I'm going to say it now anyway, is that if you're listening to this webinar live, there should be a place on your screen where you can enter questions. And I know that Adrian will be encouraging you to enter questions later on, to type them in. But I'm going to ask you to try it out now, just so that you can get used to the idea. And the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you a little question. User experience is one of those words where not everyone understands it the same way. There's lots of things like this, and user experience is no exception. So the first thing I'd like to ask you is, what sort of thing is user experience? I mean, what do I mean by that? Well, an apple is a type of fruit. Real Madrid is a football team. Measles is a type of illness you can get. So what sort of thing is user experience? I'd like you to type that in to the question and answer place, if you can find it. If you can't, if you're not in a position to do that, just write it down on a piece of paper. And I'm going to give you 10 seconds to do that, because it's quite an easy question. Okay, so you've got 10 seconds starting now. And I'm going to see if anyone answers the question. When I do my training course on user experience for business analysts, I ask people this question, and we actually get quite a range of different answers this one.
So I see we've got a number of ideas coming in, Nick.
Yes, they're good. I'm looking at them right now, and very interesting. So one of those, for example, says a consideration for website usage, and that's very interesting. Some excellent ones there. Now, let me tell you about some ideas that I've got and some ways that I've heard this term being used. I'll just get rid of the little window there. Okay, so user experience. One thing that we could consider user experience to be is a professional praxis. So that's a fancy word. It means it's a collection of things that people do, methods, techniques, activities, and tools that people use when they're doing something in particular. So people sometimes use user experience in that sense. It's almost a professional discipline that people use. Another way people use it is to describe a mindset. So I sometimes hear people saying, oh, you're not doing user experience, or you're not doing user experience properly, or that person is not really taking a user experience attitude to that. Well, what do they mean by that? Well, hopefully we'll have time to just scratch the surface of that. sometimes people, when they say user experience, they mean an organizational unit. When they say, I need to talk to UX about that, they mean I need to talk to the UX people in my organization. It's, of course, it's an academic discipline as well as a professional discipline. You can study it at university. So all those things are perfectly valid ways to understand the term user experience. But full marks to the person who said, and when I say full marks, it wasn't a test, but I agree with the person who said user experience is quite literally what it says. User experience is someone's experience, company. So it's something much wider than what some people understand by user experience. Some people think that it is purely to do with visual design. It's not purely to do with visual design. It's about what someone experiences when they're interacting with a system. So there's an ISO standard, which does actually, I think it's very helpful to have international standards when you're dealing with these terms that are so ambiguous and understood in various different ways. And there's this ISO standard 1941210, which is kind of the basis for the book that I'm writing. And this is how they define user experience. It's a person's perceptions and responses resulting from the use and or anticipated use of a product, system, or service. So it's not just about what you think when you're using the product, system, or service right now. It's about what you experience when you're thinking about using it in the future, and it's about what you experience when you have used it in the past. When we think about user experience, as I say, some people think about software products, they think about websites. And if we're interacting with an organization, let's say it's an e-commerce company, we might think the user experience of dealing with that e-commerce company is about the user interface that you can see when you go to their website and when you buy things. But when you buy things on the website, it's not just about what you see on the website, is it? There's a whole ecosystem there. Coming back to this word system, there are the delivery people who bring the stuff to your door. There are the people who answer your queries when something goes wrong with the delivery. So to think of it in terms of a nice sort of glossy design is not what it's all about. So I've got a picture I'm showing on the screen here of this was a YouTube video from the Czech Republic, and it's someone physically attacking a delivery driver and hitting the delivery van with a hockey stick. So I don't know if it's a real video or not, but the point is it's all part of the user experience. It's all those human aspects. It's not just about the computer system. And here's another definition of user experience that I like a lot, which captures that. It says user experience is the value derived from interactions or anticipated interactions with a product or service and the supporting cast in the context of use, e.g. time, location, and user disposition. So that brings out this point about the supporting cast. It's not just about the interaction that you think you're going to have with the service. It's all those people and activities that go on that go to make up the overall experience. And when we think about user experience, traditionally people have thought about a very neat and tidy setup where there's a person using a computer to do stuff. This is the paradigm that underlies academic human-computer interaction, or it used to. The idea that a person a person is almost like a computer themselves. Input goes in through their sensory organs, they process it inside, and output goes out through their fingertips or whatever it is. And so they're interacting with the computer like that. But in real life, there's an awful lot more to it than that. Interaction with computers, when people do it as part of their work, it's messy. People are doing lots of things at the same time. They're constantly being interrupted. They're having to fit it in with everything else that they're doing. It's a social thing. So it's not just about one person sitting down at a computer and doing stuff. Invariably, or almost invariably, when someone is using a system, they're doing it together with someone else, or as part of a situation where they're cooperating with someone else in some way, or interacting with someone else in some way. And so we have to design the interaction with the system with that in mind. We have to support the interactions that those people are having. And it's improvised, as well as being messy. It's improvised. It's hard to predict exactly how people are going to use our software products, how people are going to use our services, how people are going to interact with our organization. So that international standard that I mentioned is all about human-centered design. I prefer to use this term people-oriented design because it just feels a little more appropriate to me. Very often, what's at the center of what we're doing is actually not the people, it's the product. So I think it's a kind of a little bit more honest to admit that what's in the center of what we're doing is actually the product. But at the same time, everything that we're doing needs to be oriented towards those people, the people that we're doing it for. And it's a cycle. It's a cyclical process. There are 5 things that we have to do. We have to plan, we have to understand, we have to specify, we have to make, and we have to evaluate. So let's look at those in a bit more detail. Here's a little schematic that shows very clearly that it's a cycle. It fits in. You can see straight away, this may remind you of some diagrams that you've seen describing agile methods. And people-oriented design does fit in very, very well with an agile approach. So I put some extra words in here: plan the work, understand the context, specify the requirements, make designs, and evaluate the designs. And these are the sort of headings from the international standard, although I've changed the wording very slightly to make it a little bit clearer. And just to go through those, plan the work. That's not something that you just do up front as a one-off thing, even though the diagram suggests that it is. Absolutely not. It's an ongoing thing. It's a planning-driven process rather than a plan-driven process. And I should say, when I use the term process, I want to make it absolutely clear this is not a sequential, a step-by-step process. It's not a fixed sequence. The sort of frightening thing about showing a diagram like this is you always worry that people are going to interpret it as a cookbook recipe, a kind of cookie cutter approach. It's exactly the same if you're familiar with the business analysis body of knowledge guide. Even though it says in that book quite explicitly, this is not a sequential step-by-step process that prescribes a cookie cutter approach. Guess what? A lot of people do understand it that way. So please, if you take one thing away from this, remember that this is not a cookie cutter process. It's just a framework for understanding what goes on. So as well as planning the work, what do we do? The next thing is we have to understand the context, and this is all about studying people in their environment. The context, the most important thing in the context, or what the standard calls the context of use, is the people who are going to be using the system. So we have to study them, and we have to find out what are their pain points, what are the things that they're trying to do, what are the things that they are using at the moment, what are the problems they have with using those things, what are the workarounds that they use in order to get over those problems. And it's all about observing people. It's not about asking people what they want. And that's perhaps a mistake that sometimes we make as business analysts. We ask people what they want and we take it as gospel truth. What we're trying to do, if we're taking a people-oriented approach or a human-centered approach, a user-centered approach, we're trying to get empathy for those people. And when I say empathy, I'm not suggesting some kind of woolly, fuzzy, feel-good type of emotion. I'm suggesting that we need to understand those things that I just mentioned. What are the goals that those people have? What are they trying to achieve? What are the problems they have achieving those things? And that's true when you're in a work environment, or whether you're in a leisure environment or in any other kind of setting. Those things hold true. It's all about people's goals. So that's understanding the context, and you can see there's a couple of little people there. The two activities that are shown in the blue strip across the diagram are kind of in the middle of the picture, and they've got the little icons showing people to show that you cannot do these things without involving the users of your system. You simply can't. If you don't involve the users in doing these things, you're not, as I said earlier, you're not doing user experience, and you're missing a trick. When you've made these observations about what people are doing, of course you need to interpret it. It's no good just looking and seeing and writing it down. You've got to interpret it, and people use this technique of affinity diagramming. So you'll be getting through an awful lot of post-it notes. The next thing is to specify the requirements, and the standard talks about specifying the requirements. So I've used those words here, but it's not really requirements in the traditional sense that the business analyst might understand it. It's producing some kind of documents or having some kind of interactions with the rest of your team that helps them to understand the users and the context of use. Because at the end of the day, you're not there to understand it for your own sake. You're there so that the other people in your team will also understand it and will be able to design a product or a service appropriately. So the requirements can take a number of different forms, which we'll talk about if we have time. Then the next thing is to make designs. On the basis of the understanding that you've got of what people's needs are, you're going to make designs. And what type of things those designs are is going to depend on where you are in the project, what stage of the project you are, if indeed it is a project rather than an ongoing effort, because this framework applies to an ongoing no projects effort as well. So at the early stages of the project, they're going to be prototypes for testing ideas, and at the later stages of the project, they're going to be different sorts of prototypes for actually testing whether things work. And I mentioned testing whether things work. That's the next thing to do. It's to evaluate the designs. And as I mentioned earlier, you have to involve the users in that. You have to get them to evaluate the designs. You have to see if the designs work for the users. In the standard, it talks about evaluating the designs against the requirements, but actually, I would prefer it if it didn't say that. I would rather evaluate the designs against the user needs, because it may be that you've actually got the requirements wrong. And this is the great thing about a user-centered approach. If you get the users to evaluate your designs all the way through, you will find out if your requirements are wrong, because you're evaluating the designs against the user's needs that they actually know and understand, rather than against some intermediate artifact that you've created called a requirements document or something like that. And then you go around the cycle again, and each time you go around this cycle, it might be different, but you're going to be replanning. You're going to be planning what you're going to do in the next cycle. There you can see that there are some arrows going to other places as well. So you might go from evaluating the designs back to some usability testing to see if what you've produced can be used by people, and then find that it needs a few tweaks. So instead of going all the way around the circle again, you just go straight back into make designs, you make a few tweaks, and then you carry on from there. So as I mentioned before, both of those stages, evaluating the design and understanding the context, absolutely essential to involve the users in that. So here's another look at the cycle, and on here I've annotated it with some of the work products that you might typically expect to be produced as part of this. So planning the work, you might produce some kind of approach definition document, or you will have some kind of discussions, because this is not all about documents, it's about discussions also. When you're working on understanding the context, you're going to be doing things like taking notes. So the principal things you'll be doing in that phase is doing observations and interviewing people. So you'll have notes, you'll have recordings. Hopefully you will take some pictures of people in the context of use. And as part of that, you'll make observations, you'll notice things, you'll see things, you'll hear things, which tell you, these are some problems that these people have, these are some goals that they have, these are some difficulties that they have at the moment, these are the workarounds that they use, etc. Then in the specifying requirements stage, I've just put down a few types of things that people might do here, but there are an awful lot of them. We don't have time to discuss them in detail. Journey maps, storyboards, empathy maps, user profiles, personas, and something that perhaps will be more familiar to BAs, user stories. And those things form the basis for the next stage, which is making designs. But remember that I said you may have the requirements wrong. I think it's important to remember that. This framework is very compatible with Eric Ries's book about the lean startup, where he talks about producing two hypotheses. You have a problem hypothesis and a solution hypothesis. So when you're specifying the requirements, what you're doing is you are coming up with the problem hypothesis. You're saying that this is the problem that we think we should be solving for people. And when you go into the next stage, the make design stage, you're saying these are some ways that we might go about providing a solution to this problem. And there you're going to be producing things like sketches, task flows, storyboards, sitemaps, wireframes, prototypes, and all sorts of different models that you might use. So these are at wildly different levels of detail, but they're all following this same approach, specifying the requirements, making the designs, evaluating the designs. Then when you evaluate the designs, the key thing is to test the design with users. So try to produce something that where you can actually observe users trying to do stuff with what you've produced. That doesn't have to be computer software or web software. It can be some kind of paper prototype. It can be some kind of role-playing situation. It can be all sorts of things. It can be some kind of model. It needs to be something that you can use to test your hypotheses about what the solution should be like. And when I say what should the solution be like, that covers everything. It covers what it should look like, which is what people often tend to think the user experience is about, but it's not just about what it looks like, it's about what it does and how it works and how it supports people in their lives, really. And then finally, when we're going from evaluating the designs to back round the cycle, I've mentioned up there at the top story maps, because that's quite a key technique for sort of knitting together your findings about what works with the user stories that you've been working on and the other things that you've been working on. It helps to give you a kind of compass to navigate what should you be doing next. Because at any given stage, that's really what you're working towards, is what should you be doing next? How are we going to maximize the probability that what we end up producing is something that's good, that's useful, and it's usable? So in a way, what we're doing in a user experience approach is very analogous to what business analysts do anyway. It's about de-risking the project. It's about trying to make sure at any given stage in the project, on any given day of the project, you are maximizing the chance that tomorrow you're closer to a good, useful, usable product than you were yesterday. And so it goes on. I thought that I had to put in a slide about roles. I'm hesitant to do this because anyone who works in user experience will see this and immediately start saying, oh, well, no, we don't do it like that, because everyone does it differently. But so this is for the benefit of people who aren't really involved in user experience at the moment and wonder what all these people do. I've tried to suggest what things those roles are all about. So planning the work, typically something that managers, user experience consultants, and architects do. Understanding the context, very much something for the user researcher. Specifying the requirements, there's a wide range of people get involved with that: UX designers, architects, user researchers, requirements engineers, and business analysts. And then making the designs, really, that will vary even more widely depending on what it is that you're making. So if you're talking about navigating through a site, for example, and navigating through a piece of software, that's the information architect's job. If it's about how do the interactive aspects of a user interface work, that's going to be the interaction designer. What does it look like or feel like? That's going to be the user interface designer. Developers are also involved there. If it's a software prototype we're producing, and then when it comes on to evaluating the designs, usability testers and user researchers be involved in that. So as I say, this slide is really there to be shot down, and I'm sure it will be. I just wanted to say a couple of things about a couple of specific techniques that I think are particularly relevant for business analysts. So personas, I know, is something that is becoming more and more well known to business analysts. And I just wanted to say a couple of things about this. The most important thing about a persona is that it's a way of helping your team to understand what the users are like. That's all it's for. And traditionally, they've been done in quite a glossy way. Sometimes they're done using some special purpose software, like this one that I produce using some special purpose software. It gives the person a name, a picture, it says some details about them. And this is an imaginary person. They are a fictional archetypal user. So in this case, Miriam Esperanza does not exist. She's someone that I made up. But I made her up on the basis of research into what the users of the system are like. So the persona description encapsulates the findings from the research. And sometimes people forget that, and they put a lot of work into producing something glossy, but it's not actually based on research. So that's the first mistake. And then another mistake people can make is then they can say, but this isn't based on research, so we need to throw it away. But that's an overreaction as well, because it is actually persona descriptions that aren't based on research. It is useful to come up with something that's just based on guesswork or on asking business stakeholders in the organization what they think the users are like. You just need to be aware of that. And it's coming back to this idea of hypotheses. It's more helpful to treat personas as hypotheses Just get something down in a very rough and ready form and say, okay, we're going to base this cycle, not the whole project, we're going to base the current cycle on this idea of what our users are like. So it can be very, very rough and ready. And I like the technique. There's a book called Lean User Experience by Jeff Gotthelf, and he talks about proto-personas. And a proto-persona is a type of persona description that very much is very much based on this idea of being a hypothesis, something that's really thrown together quite quickly, and it's something that's interactive. You can put it up on the wall, you can draw it in a sketchy kind of way. You don't have to make it glossy. In fact, it's actually better not to make it glossy because people will feel that they can change it. It's exactly the same with other sorts of prototype, and a proto-persona is another type of prototype. So it's keeping it fluid, and it's helping people understand that it's there to be changed. So I suggest don't do your personas like this one of Miriam Esperanza. Just get a blank sheet of paper. If it can be a sheet of A0 paper, you can put it up on the wall and get people to collaborate on designing the persona. Another thing that I mentioned earlier people do is a journey map. And again, journey maps, this is one that I found using Google on the web. This is not a journey map that I produced. And you can see it's been produced using special purpose software, or certainly it's been done in a very glossy way. You can't see the detail, and that's deliberate. The point is, I would be frightened to change this. I would look at it and think, I don't really think I understand what's going on here, and I don't dare to change it. And some people will look at it and say, well, what even is a journey map? Well, all a journey map is it's a drawing that demonstrates what someone's experience is like over time with the system, the product, or service. So I'd like you to do another little exercise for me now. If you are sitting down somewhere with a sheet of paper, if you've got a sheet of paper and a pen, just take your piece of A4 paper, which it probably is, and put it in a landscape orientation, and then draw a line across it, across the middle of the sheet. And at the right hand of that line, draw an arrow. Now you've drawn your time axis. Then on the left-hand margin, on the top half of the paper, draw a happy face. The bottom half of the paper, draw an unhappy face. And then we're going to do a user journey for what it was like for you getting up and going to work this morning. So think of the first thing that happened when you woke up this morning. And the great thing about this exercise is no one else can see this. So no one else knows what you're telling me. So you can put down anything you like on your journey map describing what happened to you first thing this morning. So if it was something that makes you feel happy, write it down in the top half. The happier it made you feel, put it higher up on the paper. If it made you feel unhappy, such as being woken up by people shouting outside early in the morning, like me this morning, then you need to put it in the lower half. And then what was the next thing that happened after that? Maybe you got up, you had a shower, you had breakfast. I don't know. You could have done absolutely anything. What did you do after that? And then after that was the next thing you did. And what was the next thing you did after that? And write them down in the different positions on the paper, depending on how happy they made you feel. And if you've written down 3, 4, 5 or more things, you've done a journey map. And you know what? That journey map that you've just done is I would suggest more fit for purpose. It's more useful in this kind of iterative cyclical approach than the one we're looking on at the screen at the moment. Not that I mean to criticize this one in any way, but I think it's much more helpful if we do things in a sketchy way. It helps us to understand that they're only there as and a service map. This is related to the same topic, and again, we don't have time to talk about it in detail, but it's another variation of what you can do with the customer journey concept. So that's quite enough of me talking. I'm hoping that you'll have some questions, comments, thoughts about what we've talked about so far. So back over to you, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Nick. And yes, to everyone live on the call, please do type your questions in. And I can see we have some questions coming in already. Also, I know that some of you have been experiencing some issues with sound and connectivity. Apologies for that, and thank you so much for staying with us. If anyone did miss anything, by the way, we will be publishing a recording of this session. We generally try and get that live within a couple of days. So if there was anything that dropped out and you didn't manage to catch, you can log on again and look at the recording. So we'll be sending an email out with that link as well. So okay, so our first question is around personas, and the question is the questioner asks. I would consider using personas to understand prototyping, making and design to be ideal to use in the people-oriented design process. Are there any other easy-to-use techniques you would recommend? So I know you've spoken about a few techniques, but any other sort of really concrete techniques that you found that stakeholders really like, Nick?
Well, I think the customer journey or user journey that we were just talking about is absolutely great, because you know, any technique that's easy for people to understand is brilliant, and you really can't get much more easy to understand than that. The great thing about the service blueprint is that what it effectively has is a customer journey along the top, and then you can put lots and lots more detail underneath about what you're actually putting in place to support that ideal customer journey. So it's something that you can use to describe the as-is situation, and it's something you can use to describe the to-be situation. There's other things that are great, storyboards. So that's basically, well, there are different ways that people use the word storyboard, but my favorite way of doing it is a bit like a comic strip, showing people interacting with your product or service. So let's say for the sake of argument, it's a mobile app. It will show people looking at their mobile phones in various different contexts, but it will also show them, well, in the context. So it will help you to see whether or not what it is that you're designing actually makes sense or not, whether it fits into their lives. So that's a great thing. Another thing is the empathy map, which you may have come across in one of Alex Osterwalder's books. The idea of an empathy map. So it talks about what is it that for a given persona or person, what do they hear at any given point? What are they looking at? What do they feel? What are their pain points? And what can we do for them? So that's another really, really low-tech, useful way of getting to where you want to be. And finally, I suppose, user stories, which a lot of us have been familiar with some time, but they're so quick to produce. I won't say they're easy to produce, but they're very, very quick, and they're very easy to change. So those are some things that, in terms of specifying requirements, those are some great things that you can do.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Nick. Another question is around the difference between user experience and customer experience. What is there a difference, Nick? And if there is, how would you describe it?
Wow, yeah, that's a real hot potato. So if there are some people whose job is customer experience, and they will tell you customer experience is more important than user experience, and it's a broader concept. And the people whose job is user experience will tell you user experience is more important than customer experience, and it's a broader concept. I think the main reason there are two different words is that they come from different cultural backgrounds. So customer experience is the study of how people interact with your organization and your brand over a period of time. And that has its roots in the marketing discipline. The first people who were talking and writing about customer experience were marketing people. User experience is also the study of how people interact with your brand and products. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But the background of user experience is in the design type disciplines and also in psychology. And so it's simply historical and cultural, in my opinion. They're really trying to deal with the same questions. That's my take on it.
Oh, fantastic! Probably quite a debate, I'd imagine, on that one, Nick, in some of the online forums. So one that there's probably quite a lot a lot of opinions on, I'd imagine.
That's right.
Okay. Our next question is around. You mentioned role playing as a potentially a way of prototyping, and I'm kind of going to embellish this question a little bit, because those of us that are familiar with BA BOK version 3 will be familiar that one of the techniques in there is collaborative games. And one of the interesting things about the collaborative games element of BA BOK is it only gives a couple of examples. And so I just wondered whether you had any examples of where you've used role play as either an elicitation or a validation, or even if you can't, for client reasons, mention an example, whether you could sort of give a sample of how we might use role play.
Well, let's say, for example, that you're designing some kind of device that is like a kiosk that people are going to interact with in a public place. You might want to start off prototyping that, not by designing screens, but you might want to think about the people actually being in that space and what it is that they want to do. So you want to encourage people to think that is actually what's going on. And you can produce a very, very low-tech prototype just made out of cardboard. And you can use a technique called Wizard of Oz prototyping. If you're familiar with the story of the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and her friends, the Lion and the Tin Man and the Scarecrow, went in search of this very, very famous and very, very powerful wizard. And right at the end of the story, it transpires that the wizard who is able to make these amazing things happen is actually a little old man sitting behind a curtain, using some very, very simple low-tech techniques to fool people. And that's what you can do with Wizard of Oz prototyping. So you can actually hide behind the cardboard prototype. You can ask people to come along to your kiosk and ask it questions. And then depending on the questions that they ask or the pretend buttons that they press, you can tell them some answers that you make up on the spur of the moment, just like the Wizard of Oz. That is such fun. So that's the first thing that pops into my mind. But the types of role play that you can use, it's limited only by your imagination. Really, it's any situation where it's something at a higher level than what you can prototype just by looking at prototypes of screens.
Fantastic. And as you were describing that, Nick, that Wizard of Oz prototyping, which is it's a really nice summation, but that reminded me a lot of some of the stuff in the Lean Startup. You mentioned Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup, but I know that's got a very similar feel, where just get something out there and see how people react to it. Okay,
that's
so
it's all about shortening.
Sorry, Nick.
I was just saying that's absolutely right. It's all about shortening that feedback loop, so you get feedback on whether you're doing the right thing as fast as possible. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great. Our next question. In fact, we've got a couple of similar questions, so I'll kind of bundle them. Is around some of the artifacts and how they relate to requirements. So, for example, would you say that would you sort of agree with the statement that journey maps and some of the other tools that we've talked about don't really they don't document requirements, but they are used to elicit requirements? And if you'd agree with that, what other techniques would you sort of align those with to document requirements? And also, are there any elicitation techniques that you would recommend to be used alongside the techniques you've mentioned? So I know that's quite a big question. So I don't know if you want to handle that one in parts, Nick.
Well, I suppose the last part of that is in a logical sense the first part. So what elicitation techniques would you use? But they're really, to my mind, the only elicitation techniques that you use are pretty much the ones that I've mentioned. So it's about observing people in their real context. It's about interviewing them, but not interviewing them in a kind of extremely goal-directed, problem-solving, analytical way. It's more about being sponge-like and soaking up what it's like to be that person and to have that person's concerns and problems. So it's about developing empathy. So it's maybe a slightly different style of interviewing from what people are used to. Much more open questions, for example. And then, again, still thinking about elicitation techniques, it really, you are eliciting requirements when you evaluate the designs. That's the whole point of evaluating the designs. They help you to elicit more requirements. Another technique that is a type of elicitation, a technique I haven't mentioned, which is card sorting, where if you want to design what's a good way of navigating around an interface, or how you should organize content on a website or something like that, you can give people a deck of cards where you've put the names of all the different things that are going to be presented as part of that interface. And you ask people to sort them into groups, depending simply on what they think are logical groups. And that will tell you a lot about people's mental models. And that's what you're trying to elicit, is you're trying to elicit people's mental models. It's the way that people think about the subject. So all these techniques are really designed with that in mind. Some of them seem very, very low tech, and people will think, well, is that all there is to it? But that's because it's all about meeting the users where they are and trying to develop that direct empathic connection with the way that people feel and think, without imposing any structure on it, without bringing in too many artificial constructs or concepts. It's all about trying to understand that person's construct system that they have in their head. So coming back to the other part of the question, which was about artifacts. No, to be honest, I don't completely agree that, for example, a journey map is not a requirement specification. I know some of us have gone through a lot of training and socialization, shall we say, as part of the business analysis profession, which teaches us that a requirement is a certain type of thing, and it's often to be found in a requirements catalogue, and it might be categorized into non-functional, functional requirements and all this sort of thing. But if we look at journey maps, for example, like a lot of these techniques, they can be used to document an as-is situation, or they can be used to document a to-be situation. When we did the example with talking about how you got up in the morning and so on, we were documenting the as-is situation. But you can imagine an organization, let's say for the sake of argument, it's an energy company or a telecommunications company, doesn't matter. They might say this isn't very satisfactory. There are changes we want to make to this. We want people's experience to be different. So you're actually getting into the realms now of designing people's experience. How can you do that? Well, of course you can't literally design the way people experience the world, because everyone's experience of the world is very much their own thing, and it's, in a sense, it's inaccessible to other people. But you can try to make certain changes to the process that they have to go through, so that the likelihood of it being a good experience will be better. And so you can produce 2B journey maps, just as you would produce a 2B business process model. I mean, I'm sure people would agree that a business process model is a type of requirement specification. So the same thing with journey maps, really. Same thing with storyboards. Same thing with empathy maps, and of course user stories. User stories are really the workhorse of agile projects in terms of specifying the requirements, and I think they go very, very well with a user experience approach. So really, that's I guess that would be my top pick, if you like.
Yeah, just hearing you speak there, Nick, I was wondering, because again, I was thinking back to the requirement types. I know there are different requirement schemas out there, but taking, for example, the requirement schema in BABOK, where you have business requirements, so outcomes and that sort of thing. But then you have the solution requirements, but you have stakeholder requirements in the middle. So what I'm wondering, and I haven't really, I'm just thinking this through on my feet, is whether perhaps some of these artifacts sit at that stakeholder requirement level, if we were to map them to BABOK. So they're not the detailed solution requirements, but they're somewhere between your high-level business, outcomes and your detailed functional, non-functional requirements. Would you think that is sensible, or am I in the wrong ballpark?
No, Adrian, no, I think you're in exactly the right ballpark. People talk about user requirements. That perhaps that's a term that I've heard more often than stakeholder requirements. And the standard talks about user requirements, and I think that's exactly right. The only thing is that traditionally you find, when business analysts are doing this, they will talk to certain business stakeholders, and they will get a sort of partial view of the details of what's required, very much based on business drivers. And traditionally, people haven't tended to think of stakeholder requirements or user requirements as encompassing this whole field of how do people actually feel about using the product or service, which in my view is a mistake, because if that's really what determines whether the product or service is successful or not, how people feel about it. So I think there needs to be a lot more emphasis on it than there sometimes is. But yes, I do agree with you. It is kind of that's where it fits in the BABOK scheme of things. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you, Nick. And I mean, definitely that whole empathy and making sure that people enjoy using whatever service it is, or product, or system, in the systems thinking sense of the word we're working on, so important. So Nick, I know you have a book that is coming out. So tell us more. What's the title of the book, and when will it be released?
Haha. So it's User Experience Foundations. It's published by BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT, and it will be out in 2018. Now, I can't tell you exactly when, but keep your eyes peeled. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, I'll let you know.
Fantastic. And I was about to ask how people should make contact with you if they want to stay in touch. So LinkedIn and Twitter. Okay, well, fantastic. So, I mean, thank you once again, Nick, for a really, really insightful and interesting presentation there. And thank you. I know that behind the scenes we've had a couple of technical hiccups. Thank you for for sort of making it seem like they weren't there. So the show must go on, as they say. So, if you could just flick to the next slide briefly for me, Nick, just before we formally close. I wanted to say again a huge thank you to Nick. I'm sure we've all found that session really, really useful, and also thank you to everyone who's dialed in. As if you're on the previous webinar, the idea behind this webinar series is just to talk about some some things that are perhaps outside of the core BA focus, but areas which might be of interest to us as BAs. So we have a whole range of them scheduled. The next one is on the 21st of September. One piece of feedback we got from the last webinar is some people said it might be useful if we could have some during the day. So we're going to try doing the next one at 12:30 lunchtime. So hopefully that may be more convenient for some people. But if not, it will be recorded. It's virtual leadership with Penny Pullen. I'm sure many of us in the BA community will be familiar with Penny's work there as well. As a final favour, you will get an email after this webinar just asking for some feedback. There's a very, very quick SurveyMonkey link. It'll take you like 3 minutes. It's 3 questions. Would be very, very grateful if you could fill that in. And remember, we aim to get the recording up in just a few days' time. So the email will have that link on it as well. And in a few days' time, the recording will go up there. So all that's left for me to say is a massive thank you again to Nick for presenting to us. A very useful session. Thank you very much for everyone that dialed in, and speak to you all again soon. So good evening to everyone.